Some scars are inked into skin, but the ones that matter are remembered by the men who survived beside you. The laughter started before Thomas Walker even reached the display honoring the history of America's elite Special Operations Forces. At 82 years old, the retired veteran walked slowly across the polished concrete courtyard outside the Delta Force Heritage Center, his weathered oak cane tapping a steady rhythm beneath the warm Texas sun. A gentle breeze stirred the American flag above the entrance while families, active-duty soldiers, veterans, and young recruits wandered between exhibits celebrating decades of courage and sacrifice. Thomas wore a simple navy blazer over a light blue shirt with neatly pressed khaki pants. Nothing about him demanded attention except the quiet confidence in his eyes. He had visited military museums before. He knew that history usually remembered units, not individuals. That never bothered him. He had not come searching for recognition. He had come because an old promise had brought him back. As he paused beside an outdoor display featuring the earliest Delta Force missions, he slowly rolled his sleeve just above his wrist to adjust the leather strap of his watch. A faded tattoo briefly appeared against his weathered skin before disappearing beneath the fabric again. It lasted only a second, yet it was enough. A young Delta Force captain standing several feet away noticed it immediately. Captain Ethan Brooks was 34 years old, physically fit, respected by his team, and proud of the unit he served. His sharp eyes narrowed as he stepped closer with several younger operators following behind him. One of them whispered something that quickly spread through the small group. Within moments, quiet chuckles became open laughter. Another soldier folded his arms while studying the elderly visitor with unmistakable skepticism. Ethan finally stopped directly in front of Thomas, keeping a professional posture but unable to hide his disbelief. "Sir, where did you get that tattoo?" he asked. Thomas looked at him calmly. "A long time ago," he answered. Another operator smiled. "Looks pretty convenient. That symbol has been copied by collectors for years." Several nearby visitors turned to watch. A family paused beside an armored vehicle display. A pair of retired Marines exchanged uncertain glances. Even the museum volunteer behind the welcome desk sensed the growing tension. Thomas neither defended himself nor appeared offended. He simply rested both hands on the handle of his cane and quietly observed the young faces standing before him. Captain Brooks crossed his arms. "Delta Force has earned its history. We take impersonation seriously." Thomas nodded gently, as though acknowledging an ordinary conversation about the weather. "That is a good thing," he replied. "History deserves to be protected." His calm answer somehow made the silence even heavier. One young operator shook his head before pulling out his phone. "Let us see if the system recognizes that tattoo." He zoomed in carefully while another soldier laughed under his breath. Thomas remained perfectly still, allowing the photograph without protest. His eyes drifted toward the memorial wall near the entrance where hundreds of names reflected decades of service. For just a moment, the sounds of children laughing, distant helicopters crossing the blue sky, and flags snapping in the afternoon breeze blended into memories only he could hear. Captain Brooks submitted the image through an internal military verification application, expecting the result to settle the matter within seconds. The screen processed longer than anyone expected. Conversations slowly faded as every soldier leaned closer. Instead of rejecting the image, the system displayed a plain black screen with a single line of white text that none of them had ever seen before. "Authorized personnel only." Beneath those words appeared one final instruction. "Do not proceed. Notify command immediately." The smiles disappeared. Even Thomas Walker looked quietly toward the screen, as though recognizing an old friend whose name had not been spoken in more than half a century. Captain Ethan Brooks stared at the warning on the screen as though the words themselves had become impossible to understand. Around him, every conversation inside the Heritage Center faded into uneasy silence. The younger operators exchanged uncertain glances, each waiting for someone else to explain what none of them had ever seen before. The internal verification application was designed to identify authentic insignia, historical unit markings, and restricted military symbols. It was not supposed to refuse access. It certainly was not supposed to order immediate notification of command. Ethan carefully refreshed the application. The same message appeared again without delay. "Authorized personnel only. Do not proceed. Notify command immediately." His confidence slowly gave way to curiosity. He looked back toward Thomas Walker, expecting to find anxiety or impatience. Instead, the elderly veteran remained exactly where he had been moments earlier, both hands resting comfortably on the top of his weathered oak cane. His expression carried neither satisfaction nor concern. It was simply calm, as though he had watched this same misunderstanding unfold many times throughout his long life. One of the younger operators finally broke the silence. "Sir, who exactly are you?" Thomas smiled gently before looking toward the memorial wall again. "Just someone who is older than most stories here," he answered quietly. Another operator attempted to laugh, but the sound disappeared almost immediately. Something about the situation no longer felt humorous. The museum volunteer stepped closer with visible concern, while several visiting veterans watched from nearby exhibits without saying a word. Captain Brooks lowered his phone and spoke more respectfully than before. "Mr. Walker, I need to ask you to remain here while we contact headquarters." Thomas nodded once. "Take all the time you need." There was no frustration in his voice, only patience. Ethan immediately contacted the operations desk inside the administrative building. After identifying himself, he carefully described the unusual system response. The duty officer listened in complete silence before asking a single question. "Is the tattoo still visible?" Ethan glanced toward Thomas. "Yes, sir." Another brief pause followed. Then the officer responded with unexpected seriousness. "Do not allow the visitor to leave. Do not question him further. Maintain professional courtesy. Senior command will be notified immediately." The line disconnected before Ethan could ask another question. He lowered the phone slowly, now feeling something entirely different from skepticism. The younger operators noticed the change in his face. None of them joked anymore. One quietly moved aside to create a more comfortable place for Thomas to sit, but the elderly veteran politely declined with a warm smile. "Standing is still easier than sitting down," he said with a trace of humor that earned the first genuine smile from anyone around him. Above the entrance, the American flag continued to move gently beneath a cloudless Texas sky while visitors resumed walking through the exhibits, although many still glanced curiously toward the growing circle surrounding the quiet old man. Minutes passed. Ethan remained beside Thomas, no longer as an investigator confronting a possible impersonator, but as an officer waiting beside someone whose identity had suddenly become far more significant than anyone had imagined. Deep inside the headquarters building, phones began ringing between offices that rarely communicated directly. Names were mentioned in lowered voices. Secure records were accessed. A chain of notifications quietly climbed higher through military leadership until it reached an office where a senior officer looked at the transmitted photograph for less than 3 seconds before immediately standing from his desk. He reached for his uniform jacket without hesitation and spoke with complete certainty. "Prepare my transportation. I am going there myself." The atmosphere outside the Heritage Center continued to shift in ways that none of the young operators could explain. The laughter that had filled the courtyard only minutes earlier had been replaced by quiet conversations spoken in careful voices. Captain Ethan Brooks remained beside Thomas Walker, no longer studying the elderly veteran with suspicion, but with growing respect. He had spent his entire military career believing that every important chapter of Delta Force history had been documented somewhere inside secure archives. Yet the warning displayed by the verification system suggested that an entirely different history existed beyond everything he had ever been taught. Thomas rested both hands upon his weathered oak cane while watching families wander peacefully through the exhibits. Children climbed into the display helicopter under the guidance of smiling parents. Retired service members exchanged old stories beneath rows of American flags. The ordinary rhythm of the afternoon continued, but inside the small circle surrounding Thomas, every passing minute seemed unusually heavy. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Mr. Walker, have you visited this place before?" Thomas smiled gently without taking his eyes from the memorial wall. "Not this museum. The last time I stood beside some of these men, none of us had gray hair." Ethan considered asking another question, but remembered the instructions from headquarters. Do not question him further. Instead, he simply stood beside the old veteran, allowing the silence to settle naturally between them. Nearby, one of the younger operators quietly approached Ethan. "Sir, headquarters just called again." Ethan stepped several feet away before answering. The voice on the other end sounded even more formal than before. "Captain Brooks, confirm the visitor remains on site." "Yes, sir." "Has he been treated with respect?" Ethan paused briefly before answering honestly. "We are correcting that now, sir." The officer accepted the answer without criticism. "Good. A senior officer is already en route. Estimated arrival is less than 45 minutes. Until then, no photographs are to be distributed outside military channels. No further database searches. No interviews. Maintain the current situation exactly as it is." The connection ended once again without explanation. Ethan slowly lowered the phone while looking toward Thomas. Every answer seemed to create two new questions. Across the country, inside a secure office decorated with framed campaign maps and unit photographs, General Daniel Hayes sat inside a military transport aircraft preparing for departure. An electronic tablet rested on his lap, displaying only one photograph. It showed nothing more than an elderly arm with a faded tattoo. The general studied the image in complete silence before carefully rolling back the sleeve of his own uniform jacket. On the inside of his forearm rested an almost identical tattoo, softened by decades of time, but still unmistakable. His fingers briefly touched the faded lines before he looked out the aircraft window. The expression on his face was not surprise. It was recognition. Memories that had remained undisturbed for more than 50 years quietly returned with the sound of spinning helicopter blades and distant jungle rain that no longer existed except inside his mind. Back at the Heritage Center, visitors gradually noticed that additional military vehicles had begun arriving outside the entrance. Uniformed personnel quietly positioned themselves without creating alarm. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody explained what was happening. Thomas simply watched the movement with calm eyes before looking toward the wide Texas sky. The afternoon sunlight reflected gently across the memorial wall, as though the names carved into polished stone were silently waiting for someone who had finally come home. The waiting became strangely peaceful. Nearly 40 minutes had passed, yet Thomas Walker never checked his watch, never asked a question, and never appeared impatient. He simply stood beside the memorial wall with the same quiet posture that had first unsettled Captain Ethan Brooks. The younger officer found himself studying the elderly veteran in a completely different way now. Every wrinkle seemed earned. Every slow movement carried deliberate confidence. Whatever truth headquarters had uncovered, Thomas had clearly lived with it for decades without expecting anyone else to understand. Around them, the Heritage Center remained open to visitors, but word had quietly spread that something unusual was happening near the entrance. Families wandered a little more slowly. Retired service members exchanged thoughtful glances instead of casual conversation. Even the museum guides lowered their voices as though instinctively recognizing that history was about to reveal itself. Ethan finally stepped beside Thomas again. "May I ask you one thing?" Thomas turned toward him with an encouraging smile. Ethan hesitated before continuing. "How did you stay so calm when everyone questioned you?" Thomas looked toward the American flag moving gently above the courtyard before answering. "Because people can only judge what they have been taught. Time eventually teaches the rest." The simple sentence lingered in Ethan's mind long after Thomas finished speaking. He realized that he had spent the afternoon assuming that knowledge and rank automatically produced understanding. Standing beside the old veteran, he was beginning to recognize that experience often carried lessons no classroom could provide. Suddenly, the distant sound of approaching rotor blades drifted across the Texas sky. Every head in the courtyard slowly turned upward. The sound grew stronger until a military helicopter appeared beyond the trees before descending toward a secured landing area beyond the Heritage Center. Moments later, two black sport utility vehicles rolled quietly through the front security gate. Uniformed personnel moved with calm precision rather than urgency. No sirens sounded. No commands were shouted. The atmosphere became even quieter. Captain Brooks instinctively straightened his posture while the younger operators formed an orderly line without receiving instructions. They understood that whoever had arrived held extraordinary authority. One of the security officers approached Ethan and spoke in a respectful voice. "The general will be here in less than 2 minutes." Ethan nodded, suddenly aware that his heartbeat had quickened. He glanced toward Thomas, expecting some visible reaction. Instead, The elderly veteran merely adjusted his grip on the handle of his weathered cane and watched the vehicles approach with a peaceful expression that suggested he had already guessed who would step out. The first vehicle stopped only a few yards from the entrance. A military aide quickly opened the rear passenger door. General Daniel Hayes emerged wearing a perfectly pressed Army service uniform decorated with ribbons earned across a lifetime of distinguished service. Conversations throughout the courtyard stopped. Completely. Every active-duty soldier immediately stood at attention. Visitors instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path through the center of the gathering. The general acknowledged no one. He did not glance toward the memorial displays, the assembled officers, or the waiting security detail. His eyes remained fixed on a single person standing quietly beside the memorial wall. Thomas Walker looked back with the faintest smile, as though recognizing someone he had expected to see after many years apart. Without speaking a word, General Hayes began walking directly toward him while the entire courtyard watched in absolute silence, sensing that the next few moments would uncover a chapter of American military history that had never appeared inside any museum exhibit. General Daniel Hayes stopped only a few feet in front of Thomas Walker. Neither man spoke. For several long seconds, the courtyard seemed suspended outside of time. Captain Ethan Brooks had expected introductions, formal greetings, or official questions. Instead, he witnessed two old soldiers studying each other's faces with the quiet familiarity shared only by people connected through experiences that words could never fully describe. The general's expression softened in a way that none of the younger operators had ever seen. The years of command, responsibility, and public ceremony seemed to disappear, leaving behind only the memory of a much younger officer. Thomas smiled first. "You finally made General," he said with gentle warmth. A faint smile appeared across Daniel Hayes's face. "I had a good teacher." The simple exchange confused everyone standing nearby. Captain Brooks glanced toward the other operators, but they looked just as puzzled. General Hayes stepped one pace closer until he stood directly before Thomas. Without saying another word, he slowly unfastened the button on the cuff of his service uniform. Every movement was deliberate. Every eye followed his hands. The general carefully rolled his sleeve upward until the inside of his forearm became visible beneath the afternoon sunlight. A faded tattoo emerged from beneath the fabric. It carried the same unusual design, the same worn lines, and even the same small break in one corner that appeared on Thomas Walker's arm. A quiet gasp spread through the crowd. Captain Brooks stared in disbelief before instinctively looking back at Thomas. The two tattoos were unmistakably connected. They were not modern copies. They had aged together across decades. General Hayes gently touched the faded symbol before looking back at Thomas. "I promised you I would never cover it," he said softly. Thomas nodded once. "You kept your word." The courtyard fell completely silent. No camera clicked. No one whispered. Even the breeze seemed gentler as American flags moved slowly above the Heritage Center. Captain Brooks felt every assumption he had made earlier in the afternoon quietly collapse. The tattoo he had dismissed as imitation had become undeniable evidence of a forgotten bond reaching back further than his own lifetime. One of the younger operators finally found the courage to ask, "Sir, what does it mean?" General Hayes did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on the faded symbol before distant memories slowly returned. Long before Delta Force officially existed, he began quietly. There were small teams asked to solve impossible problems without recognition. Records were limited. Names were protected. Success belonged to the mission, never the individuals. Thomas lowered his eyes briefly as though hearing familiar voices carried by the wind. Daniel continued. There were no medals for what happened. There were no public ceremonies. Only those who came home remembered. Captain Brooks listened without moving. Every sentence felt like the opening page of a history book that had never been published. General Hayes looked once more at Thomas before speaking with unmistakable gratitude. "The day I received this tattoo, I was a young lieutenant who believed training could answer every question. Thomas Walker taught me that character answers the questions training cannot." The general slowly lowered his sleeve again, but the image remained fixed in everyone's mind. Nothing more needed to be displayed. The matching tattoos had already spoken louder than any official document ever could, and, for the first time that afternoon, Every soldier present understood that they were standing in the presence of a man whose greatest service had never been written into the public record. No one moved for several seconds after General Daniel Hayes lowered his sleeve. The quiet carried more weight than applause ever could. Every soldier standing in the courtyard remained perfectly still, not because they had been ordered to, but because instinct told them they were witnessing something that belonged beyond ordinary military ceremony. Captain Ethan Brooks felt the embarrassment of his earlier judgment settle heavily upon him. He had spent years learning the history of elite special operations, memorizing names, campaigns, and traditions, yet the man standing quietly before him had never appeared in any lesson. He finally understood that some chapters of history were never written because they had been protected instead. General Hayes slowly turned toward the assembled operators before speaking in a calm, steady voice that carried naturally across the courtyard. Many of you believe every important achievement is recorded inside a museum, an archive, or a citation. That is understandable. Most of military history is preserved that way, but not all of it. Every face remained fixed upon him. There were missions where success depended upon anonymity. There were people whose names could not be published because protecting the future mattered more than celebrating the past. Thomas Walker belongs to that generation. The general looked back toward the elderly veteran with unmistakable admiration. When I first met him, I was a young lieutenant with excellent training and very little wisdom. He never asked for recognition. He never spoke about courage. He simply demonstrated it through every decision he made. Thomas lowered his eyes modestly, clearly uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. General Hayes smiled gently, as though recognizing the familiar humility. The symbol on our arms was never a badge of status. It was a promise. It reminded us that the mission always came before ourselves, and that the people beside us were family long before any organization received a famous name. Captain Brooks stepped forward slowly. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier had disappeared completely. "Sir," he said quietly to Thomas, "I judged you before I understood who you were. I confused appearance with truth. I am sincerely sorry." Thomas looked at the young captain with kind eyes. "You protected the reputation of your unit. That is exactly what you were supposed to do." Ethan shook his head gently. "I should have protected your dignity too." Thomas smiled warmly. "Now you will." The simple answer carried no resentment. It offered only forgiveness and a lesson that would remain with the younger officer for the rest of his career. Around them, several operators quietly lowered their heads, reflecting upon their own first impressions. The museum visitors watched with growing emotion as the distance between generations quietly disappeared. General Hayes then reached into the inside pocket of his uniform and removed a small, carefully folded photograph protected inside a clear sleeve. Time had faded its edges, but the image remained recognizable. It showed two young soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder beneath a weathered American flag decades earlier. One was a youthful Daniel Hayes. The other was Thomas Walker, standing with the same calm expression he carried today. The general held the photograph carefully for everyone to see before returning it to its protective sleeve. "I have carried this photograph through every assignment of my career," he said softly. "Not because it reminded me of where I served, but because it reminded me of the man I hoped never to disappoint." As the afternoon sun settled lower across the Heritage Center, every person present understood that the greatest legacy was not found in medals, promotions, or public recognition. It lived quietly inside the character of those who inspired others long after history stopped writing their names. Captain Ethan Brooks stood quietly for several moments before reaching toward the Velcro patch fastened to the sleeve of his combat uniform. Every operator nearby immediately noticed the movement. The Delta Force insignia represented years of discipline, sacrifice, and commitment. It was never removed lightly. Ethan carefully lifted the edge of the patch and held it respectfully in both hands before stepping toward Thomas Walker. The elderly veteran looked at him with gentle curiosity. Ethan stopped directly in front of him and lowered his head slightly. "Mr. Walker," he said with complete sincerity, "I cannot change how I greeted you today, but I can choose how I remember this moment for the rest of my life. I would like you to have this as a reminder that respect should always come before assumptions." He extended the patch with both hands. Thomas looked down at the insignia for a long moment before smiling warmly. He slowly closed Ethan's hands around it again instead of accepting the gift. "Keep it," he said softly. "You earned that patch. What you learned today will make you worthy of wearing it tomorrow." Ethan felt his throat tighten as the simple words carried more weight than any formal speech he had ever heard. Around them, several younger operators quietly nodded. They understood exactly what Thomas meant. Respect was not proven by giving away symbols. It was proven by honoring the values those symbols represented. General Daniel Hayes watched the exchange with unmistakable pride. "That," he said calmly, "is why some people become legends without ever trying." He turned toward the assembled soldiers and continued, "The strongest leaders I have ever known never demanded admiration. They inspired it through patience, humility, and consistency." Thomas Walker spent an entire lifetime doing exactly that. The general then looked back at Thomas. "Do you remember what you told me the day we left training together?" Thomas chuckled softly. "I told you many things." Daniel smiled. "You told me that uniforms eventually change, ranks eventually disappear, and even history books become outdated. But character stays with a person until the very last day." Thomas nodded. "I was hoping you had not forgotten." "I never did," the general replied. A gentle breeze carried the sound of rustling flags across the Heritage Center as visitors stood quietly absorbing every word. Several retired veterans wiped moisture from their eyes without embarrassment. They recognized something deeply familiar unfolding before them. It was not simply a reunion. It was the passing of an unwritten tradition from one generation to another. One of the youngest operators stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir," he asked General Hayes, "why has nobody ever heard this story before?" The general answered without hesitation, "Because Thomas never wanted anyone to hear it." Every face turned toward the elderly veteran. Thomas shrugged lightly with the same modest smile that had remained throughout the afternoon. "The mission ended successfully. That was enough for me." The answer left another long silence across the courtyard. Captain Brooks realized that everything about Thomas contradicted the modern idea of recognition. He had never searched for applause, publicity, or acknowledgement. Decades had passed, while he quietly built an ordinary life carrying extraordinary memories known only by a handful of people. Yet when the truth finally appeared, it did not elevate Thomas above everyone else. Instead, it quietly challenged everyone present to become better versions of themselves. As the afternoon sunlight bathed the memorial wall in warm gold, the distance between generations no longer existed. Young soldiers, retired veterans, military families, and honored leaders stood together without speaking, united by the realization that the greatest examples of service often belonged to those who had spent an entire lifetime believing they owed no explanation to anyone. The silence lingering across the Heritage Center no longer felt uncertain. It had become a quiet expression of respect shared by every person standing beneath the waving American flags. Captain Ethan Brooks looked around the courtyard and realized that the atmosphere itself had changed. The same visitors who had arrived expecting an ordinary afternoon inside a military museum now understood they had witnessed something far more valuable than any exhibit behind glass. General Daniel Hayes slowly stepped beside Thomas Walker and faced the assembled soldiers once more. "Every generation inherits equipment, doctrine, and technology," he said in a calm voice. "But the greatest inheritance is character. Character cannot be issued. It cannot be purchased. It must be learned from someone willing to live it every single day." He glanced toward Thomas before continuing. "Many of the leadership principles we teach today were demonstrated to me long before they were written into manuals. I learned them from this man, while neither of us expected history to remember our names." Several young operators exchanged thoughtful glances. Until that afternoon, leadership had seemed closely connected to rank, assignments, and achievement. Now they were beginning to understand that true influence often remained invisible for decades. One of the retired veterans standing near the memorial wall quietly removed his cap and held it against his chest. Others nearby followed without anyone asking them to do so. The gesture spread naturally through the crowd until dozens of people stood in silent respect. Thomas noticed the movement and gently shook his head with a modest smile. "Please," he said softly, "save that respect for the families whose loved ones never came home. They carried a heavier burden than I ever did." His words settled deeply into every heart listening. Even after everything that had been revealed, He continued, directing attention away from himself and toward others. Captain Brooks found himself smiling with admiration. He understood at last why General Hayes spoke about Thomas with such gratitude. Humility like this could not be taught inside classrooms. It had to be witnessed. General Hayes reached into his pocket once more and removed a small challenge coin that had accompanied him through years of service. One side displayed the emblem of his command. The other carried a simple inscription that read, "Honor before recognition." He placed the coin gently into Thomas's hand. "This belongs with you now," he said quietly. Thomas looked at the coin before closing his fingers around it. "I will accept this," he replied, "because it reminds me of you, not of me." The general smiled warmly. "That is exactly why you deserve it." A light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass across the grounds while the late afternoon sun painted long golden shadows over the stone walkways. Families resumed moving through the museum, but now many paused as they passed Thomas, offering quiet nods or simple words of thanks. None of them knew every detail of his past, and somehow that no longer mattered. They had seen enough to recognize the measure of the man standing before them. Captain Brooks stepped beside several younger operators and spoke softly. "Remember today, someday someone will stand in front of you with a story you cannot see. Give them respect before you ask for proof." Every member of the team nodded without hesitation. The lesson would travel with them long after uniforms faded and assignments changed. As Thomas looked once more toward the memorial wall, the engraved names reflected the warm evening light, and he smiled gently, knowing that the greatest legacies were never carved into stone alone. They continued quietly inside the people who chose to live by them. The sun had begun its slow descent beyond the trees surrounding the Heritage Center, bathing the courtyard in warm amber light that softened every stone, every flag, and every face. Thomas Walker looked across the memorial wall one final time before gently slipping the challenge coin into the inside pocket of his navy blazer. He adjusted the weathered oak cane in his hand and prepared to leave exactly as he had arrived, quietly and without expectation. General Daniel Hayes stepped beside him once more. "There is one thing I have wanted to say for many years," he said. Thomas turned toward his old friend with the same patient smile that had remained unchanged throughout the afternoon. "You already have," Thomas replied. "Every decision you made after those days spoke louder than words." The general lowered his head briefly before extending his hand. Thomas accepted it with a firm but gentle grip. Nothing about the handshake appeared ceremonial. It looked like two old friends completing a conversation that had simply paused for half a century. Captain Ethan Brooks watched silently before taking one careful step forward. This time he did not speak immediately. He stood at attention, looked directly into Thomas's eyes, and delivered a flawless military salute with complete sincerity. It was not offered because of rank or regulation. It was offered because respect had finally replaced assumption. General Hayes immediately raised his own hand in salute. Without receiving a command, every Delta Force operator standing nearby followed. One by one, soldiers throughout the courtyard raised their hands until a line of quiet salutes stretched across the Heritage Center. Retired veterans removed their caps once again. Families stood silently. Children instinctively stopped talking, sensing the importance of the moment even if they could not fully understand it. Thomas looked across the gathering with visible emotion but no pride. He slowly returned the salute with steady precision, holding it for several seconds before lowering his hand. "Take care of each other," he said softly. "The people beside you will always matter more than the medals you earn." No one answered because no answer seemed necessary. Thomas turned and began walking toward the small pickup truck parked near the edge of the visitor lot. The steady sound of his cane against the pavement echoed gently through the quiet evening air. Captain Brooks watched until the elderly veteran reached the driver's door. Before climbing inside, Thomas paused and looked back toward the Heritage Center. His eyes rested briefly on the memorial wall, then on General Hayes, and finally on the young operators whose understanding of service had changed forever. He offered one small nod before quietly driving away beneath rows of American flags glowing in the last light of day. The truck gradually disappeared beyond the entrance, leaving only silence behind. General Hayes remained standing long after the vehicle was gone. Captain Brooks stepped beside him. "Sir," he asked quietly, "how do we honor someone like him?" The general looked toward the empty road before answering. by becoming the kind of people he believed we could be. The evening breeze carried the sound of rustling flags across the courtyard once more as visitors slowly resumed their walk through the museum. The exhibits had not changed. The memorial wall had not changed. Yet every person leaving that place carried something new within them. They had arrived expecting to learn about history. Instead, they had learned about character. And long after names faded from records, uniforms were folded away, and photographs grew old, the quiet example of one humble veteran would continue guiding those willing to remember. Some marks fade with time. Brotherhood never does.